The Geiger counter was clicking frantically in Ibrahim Traoré's hands as he stood in the abandoned uranium mine, 200 kilometers north of Ouagadougou. The radiation readings were off the charts, but what truly shocked the young president wasn't the toxic levels. It was the realization that for 60 years, France had been systematically robbing his country of uranium worth $33.8 billion, while paying a mere $1.2 billion in return. But how do you steal $32 billion from one of the world's poorest countries? And more importantly, how do you get away with it for 6 decades? The answer lay buried in a yellowed document that Traoré had discovered just 3 weeks earlier. A contract so outrageous that even his legal advisors thought it was a forgery. What this document revealed about French uranium extraction in Niayes, Burkina Faso, would trigger the biggest diplomatic crisis between France and Africa since independence. But first, Traoré had to survive what was coming next. 3 weeks earlier, it had been a quiet Tuesday morning when Ibrahim Traoré made a decision that would change everything. The 35-year-old leader was conducting a routine review of all international agreements signed by Burkina Faso since independence. In the dusty archives of the presidential palace, surrounded by decades of forgotten paperwork, he was determined to understand every deal his predecessors had made. Dr. Aminata Sawadogo, the country's chief legal advisor, was helping him sort through the mountains of documents. She was a brilliant woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an encyclopedic knowledge of international law. "Mr. President," Dr. Sawadogo said, holding up a yellowed folder with trembling hands, "I need you to look at this uranium mining agreement from 1963. The numbers, they don't make sense." Traoré took the document and began reading. What he saw made his blood run cold. The contract between the French company Atomique Minière Industrielle, AME, and Burkina Faso stipulated that 97% of the country's uranium reserves would be sold to France at a fixed price of $12 per ton. "This has to be a mistake," Traoré muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Uranium trades at around $40,000 per ton on the international market." Dr. Sawadogo shook her head grimly. "No mistake, Mr. President. These figures are accurate. And the contract is valid for 99 years with renewal rights exclusively held by AMI. Traoré's hands were shaking as he continued reading. This wasn't just an unfair deal. This was systematic theft on an unimaginable scale. "Dr. Sawadogo," he said, his voice growing steadier with each word, "I want you to calculate exactly how much uranium has been extracted from our soil over the past 60 years. I want to know the market value, and I want to know exactly how much we've been paid." "Mr. President, that could take weeks." "Then start now," Traoré interrupted, "and I want absolute secrecy. Nobody outside this room can know what we're investigating." Over the next 2 weeks, Dr. Sawadogo worked around the clock with a small team of trusted economists and researchers. They combed through shipping records, financial statements, and geological surveys that had been gathering dust in government archives for decades. Meanwhile, Traoré launched his own secret investigation. He contacted Major Ousmane Kaboré, head of Burkina Faso's National Intelligence Service, a quiet, methodical man in his 50s who had served in military intelligence for over 2 decades. "Major," Traoré said during a private meeting in the secure room of the presidential palace, "I need you to investigate AMI's operations in our country. Every transaction, every transfer, every report they've filed, I want to know everything." Major Kaboré raised an eyebrow. "Mr. President, that's a French company with significant political protection. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" "Major, I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Traoré replied, his jaw set with determination. "Our people deserve to know the truth." 2 weeks later, Major Kaboré returned with a dossier that would fundamentally change Traoré's understanding of his country's relationship with France. The intelligence officer spread classified documents across the conference table, each one more damning than the last. "Mr. President," Major Kaboré began, his voice heavy with the weight of his discoveries, "AME has extracted a total of 847,000 tons of uranium from Burkina Faso over the past 60 years. Based on historical and current market values, this uranium had a total worth of $33.8 billion. Traoré studied the evidence meticulously. And how much has Burkina Faso been paid? Total payments to Burkina Faso, $1.2 billion, the major replied. That means $32.6 billion was essentially stolen from our country. The room fell silent as the magnitude of the theft sank in. But Major Traoré wasn't finished with his revelations. There's more, sir. The uranium extracted from our mines currently powers 40% of France's nuclear plants. Nearly half of France's electricity needs are met by Burkina Faso uranium. Traoré stood up and walked to the window overlooking Ouagadougou. In the distance, he could see the poor neighborhoods of the capital, houses without electricity, streets without proper lighting, families living in darkness. Our uranium lights up France while our people live in darkness, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Dr. Sawadogo entered the room with additional documents that would prove even more shocking. Mr. President, she announced, I've discovered a secret annex to the 1963 contract. Traoré read the annex and felt his anger transform into something far more dangerous. Absolute resolve. The secret clause gave AMI not just uranium extraction rights but effective control over Burkina Faso's energy policies. France has prohibited us from developing our own nuclear energy program using our own uranium, Traoré said, his voice now steady as steel. They've turned us into their energy colony. That afternoon, Traoré made a decision that would reverberate around the world. He instructed his secretary to send an urgent meeting request to Philippe Dubois, AME's CEO in Burkina Faso. The message was brief but ominous. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., Presidential Palace, we need to discuss the uranium contract. Philippe Dubois was a seasoned French executive in his late 50s who had spent 25 years managing AMI's African operations. He had handled dozens of African leaders over the years, using a combination of charm, intimidation, and, when necessary, financial incentives. This young president wouldn't be any different. The next morning, Dubois arrived at the presidential palace in his luxury Mercedes, exuding confidence. In his briefcase, he carried various incentives that had proven effective with previous officials, who had asked uncomfortable questions. When he entered the meeting room, he found Traoré seated across from him with a thick folder on the table. The young president's expression was unreadable, which made Dubois slightly uncomfortable, but he wasn't worried. Mr. President, Dubois began in French, his tone a mixture of diplomacy and condescension. I understand you have some questions about our uranium partnership. Traoré opened the folder without taking his eyes off the French executive. Mr. Dubois, how much uranium has your company extracted from our soil over the past 60 years? Approximately 850,000 tons, Dubois replied proudly. A perfect example of Franco-Burkina Faso friendship and cooperation. 847,000 tons to be exact, Traoré corrected with ice-cold precision. Market value, $33.8 billion. Total amount paid to Burkina Faso, $1.2 billion. For the first time, Dubois' confidence faltered. Those figures were supposed to be confidential. Mr. President, the market conditions of that era. Mr. Dubois, Traoré interrupted, pulling out a document from his folder. These are your company's uranium sales reports from 1963 to the present day. Every kilogram, every price, every profit margin, documented in detail. Dubois recognized the documents immediately and felt his blood run cold. These were AMI's most classified financial reports. How did you obtain these documents? He stammered. That's irrelevant, Traoré replied calmly. What's relevant is that I have proof that your company has systematically robbed my country for 60 years. Traoré stood up and pointed to a map of Burkina Faso on the wall. We have 15 uranium mines in our northern regions, all controlled by your company. We have 3 million citizens without electricity. Meanwhile, your uranium lights up 25 million French homes. Dubois tried to regain his composure. Mr. President, these agreements are protected by international law. These contracts cannot be cancelled. Traoré smiled, but his eyes remained ice cold. Mr. Dubois, let me show you something else. He pulled out another document. These are the minutes from the Burkina Faso Parliament's approval of the 1963 contract. Interesting detail. 78% of the parliamentarians who voted were receiving salaries from AMI. Dubois' face had turned pale. That's defamation. We also have the money transfer records, Traoré continued relentlessly. Every parliamentarian's payment amount, dates, account numbers. Mr. Dubois, you didn't buy Burkina Faso, you stole it. Dubois made one final attempt to assert authority. Mr. President, consider the consequences of confronting France. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation. Are you threatening me, Mr. Dubois? Traoré interrupted. How interesting, because I haven't even told you my real plan yet. Traoré opened the final folder. I am hereby canceling AMI's uranium mining license in Burkina Faso. You have 72 hours to evacuate all French personnel from our territory. Dubois jumped to his feet. This is impossible. The contract is valid for 99 years. Contracts signed through corruption are null and void, Traoré said with deadly calm. I've consulted with international law experts from Burundi. There's precedent. You're declaring war on us, Dubois shouted. No, Mr. Dubois, Traoré said, standing to his full height. You declared war on us 60 years ago. I'm simply defending myself. As Dubois stormed toward the door, Traoré called after him. Oh, one more thing, Mr. Dubois, our entire conversation has been recorded. I'll be sharing it with the world tomorrow. Within hours of Dubois' departure, the French executive was on his private jet back to Paris, making frantic calls to government officials and corporate headquarters. By the time he landed, AMI stock had already begun plummeting as rumors of the African crisis spread through financial markets. But Dubois wasn't concerned about stock prices. He was worried about explaining to his government how he had lost access to one of Africa's richest uranium deposits. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré called an emergency cabinet meeting. Government ministers sat in stunned silence as their president explained his decision to cancel the uranium contract and expel the French company. Mr. President, Finance Minister Dr. Fatima Ouedraogo finally ventured. Golden Dragon provides 22% of our national budget. Without their royalties, we face economic catastrophe. Dr. Ouedraogo, Traoré replied firmly, we will find other ways. But tell me, what is the cost of doing nothing? How many more generations must live in poverty while our resources enrich others? Defense Minister Marcel Cabouret stood up, clearly alarmed. Sir, with respect, we don't have the technology or expertise to operate these mines ourselves. Then we will learn, Traoré replied without hesitation. Other nations have done it. Why not us? Foreign Minister Dr. Alois Ouedraogo expressed the concern on everyone's mind. Mr. President, France will retaliate. They'll freeze our assets, pressure our trading partners. We could lose billions. Traoré nodded gravely. I'm aware of the cost, Minister, but I've made my decision. From today, we nationalize all mining operations in Burkina Faso. No more foreign exploitation. Our minerals will be extracted by our people, for our people. As predicted, France's response was swift and brutal. Within 24 hours, President Emmanuel Macron held an emergency press conference at the Élysée Palace. Burkina Faso's decision is a flagrant violation of international law, Macron declared, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. France will take all necessary measures to protect its legitimate interests. The threat was clear, but it only strengthened Traoré's resolve. That evening, he embarked on a media blitz that would change the global conversation about African resources. In an exclusive interview with BBC World News, Traoré laid out his case with devastating precision. For 60 years, France has systematically robbed my country, he said, displaying the evidence on live television. They extracted $33.8 billion worth of uranium and paid us only $1.2 billion. This isn't trade. It's theft. His CNN interview was even more powerful. Our uranium lights up French homes while 60% of my people live without electricity. Those who call this exploitation partnership are morally bankrupt. But it was his Al Jazeera appearance that truly ignited the African continent. What France does with uranium in Burkina Faso, they do with gold, diamonds, and oil across Africa. Every resource stolen the same way. Enough is enough. Within 48 hours, Iran's uranium gate was trending worldwide. African leaders began sending messages of support. South African President Traoré has courageously exposed the truth. Africa will no longer accept exploitation. Nigerian President Burkina Faso's decision marks a turning point for the entire continent. But France's retaliation was equally swift. Economic sanctions were announced. Burkina Faso's assets in European banks were frozen, and pressure was applied to international partners to isolate the small West African nation. Just when it seemed that Traoré's gamble might backfire catastrophically, salvation came from an unexpected source. On the third day after the uranium crisis erupted, a message arrived from Beijing that would change everything. Chinese President Xi Jinping offered to establish a strategic partnership with Burkina Faso, providing technology and investment to help the country operate its uranium mines independently. China is prepared to assist Burkina Faso in developing its mineral resources, announced the Chinese foreign minister, based on mutual respect and fair terms. India and Russia quickly followed with similar offers. What France had intended as isolation became the foundation for new, more equitable partnerships. 6 months later, AMI's Burkina Faso operations had been completely shut down. Chinese technicians were building a new uranium processing facility, while Russian experts designed the country's first nuclear power plant. Most importantly, uranium revenues now flowed directly to Burkina Faso's treasury. When Traoré visited the Tambao uranium mine 6 months after the crisis, the transformation was remarkable. Where French overseers had once directed operations, Burkinabe engineers now managed every aspect of the extraction and processing. A young woman in work clothes approached him with tears in her eyes. "Mr. President," she said, her voice cracking with emotion, "I'm Miriam. I work here as an engineer. My father worked in this mine for 30 years under the French and never got promoted. I became chief engineer in 6 months." Traoré's eyes filled with moisture. "Miriam, you and young people like you are Burkina Faso's true treasure." 1 year later, Traoré addressed the UN General Assembly to a packed audience of world leaders. "Last year, we ended a 60-year system of exploitation," he declared. "Today, Burkina Faso's electricity generation has increased by 400%. Our education budget has tripled. Our healthcare system has been modernized. Most importantly," he continued, "our citizens now know they own their own resources." He concluded his speech with words that would resonate around the world. "We remain open to friendship with France, but on equal terms. We can end the era of exploitation and begin an era of genuine partnership." 18 months after the uranium crisis, President Macron made an unexpected phone call to Ouagadougou. "President Traoré," the French leader said, defeat evident in his voice, "I would like to meet. Perhaps we can make a fresh start." "President Macron," Traoré replied, "I'm always ready to talk, but this time, we'll sit at the table as equal partners." 2 years later, Burkina Faso had become Africa's leader in energy production. Traoré's courageous decision had transformed not just his country, but inspired an entire continent. Other African nations began reviewing their colonial-era contracts. Mali's gold mines, Chad's oil fields, Congo's cobalt reserves. The wave of change that began in a dusty archive in Ouagadougou was spreading across the continent. Ibrahim Traoré hadn't just canceled a uranium contract that day. He had launched Africa's economic independence movement, and it all started with a yellowed document found in a forgotten filing cabinet, proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply the courage to expose the truth. The young leader who France had dismissed as inexperienced had shown the world that when you control your own resources, you control your own destiny. And that lesson would echo through history long after the last grain of Burkina Faso uranium had powered its last French light bulb.